An Amish man bought an 18-year-old girl to set her free. But when night fell, and he saw her undress by the fire, something inside him changed forever. He thought it was just an act of mercy, a rescue from shame and hunger. But out on that lonely prairie, in a storm that could freeze a soul solid, mercy began to feel like temptation. Every whisper in town called her fallen. Every church bell reminded him of vows he'd already buried. Yet under that same roof, two broken hearts start to heal, and the truth about what really happened to her is darker than sin itself. When the preacher's son rides in, spitting lies and dragging the law behind him, the man must decide, protect her and lose his faith, or let her go and lose his soul. What happens when the man who swore to set her free realizes she's the one who could save him? Tell me in the comments where you're watching from right now, and if this story speaks to you, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across Dodge City's muddy streets as Anthony Yoder guided his wagon through the bustling frontier town. His plain black hat and simple clothes marked him as different from the rough cowboys and traders who filled the boardwalks. The wooden wheels creaked beneath crates of winter squash, apples, and preserved vegetables he'd brought to trade. The familiar scents of his produce mingled with the harsh smell of whiskey wafting from the saloons. Sawdust scattered across the walkways caught the wind, making Anthony wrinkle his nose. He'd never grown comfortable with these necessary trips into town, preferring the clean air and honest work of his farm. Sudden shouting near the stockyards drew his attention. Anthony pulled his team to a halt, his stomach turning as he saw a crowd gathering. Through the press of bodies, he glimpsed a young woman with pale blonde hair, her wrists bound with rope. A red-faced trader, reeking of cheap whiskey, had her by the arm. $20, the drunk trader bellowed, yanking the girl forward. Pretty little thing, ain't she? Good worker too, I'll warrant. The girl, she couldn't be more than 18, kept her head down, but Anthony saw her shoulders shaking. The crowd laughed and called out crude suggestions that made his ears burn. His hands tightened on the reins until his knuckles went white. This ain't right, he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. The good book spoke of treating all God's children with dignity. What he witnessed here was pure evil. Without fully thinking it through, Anthony climbed down from his wagon. His boots hit the ground with purpose as he pushed through the jeering onlookers. Up close, he could see tears tracking down the young woman's dirt-smudged cheeks. $20 silver, Anthony called out clearly, his voice carrying over the noise. The crowd fell silent, turning to stare at the plain-dressed farmer in their midst. The drunk trader squinted at him. Well now, looks like we got us a real bidder. He yanked the girl's arm again, making her stumble. You sure you want to spend good money on this one, Amish? Anthony met the man's bloodshot eyes steadily. I said $20. He reached into his coat and pulled out the coins, earned from months of honest labor. The silver caught the sunlight as he held them out. The trader's greedy gaze fixed on the money. He thrust a crumpled paper at Anthony with his free hand. Sign here then, and she's yours. Anthony's stomach churned at the words, but he took the paper. His signature was neat and precise, despite his shaking hands. The moment the trader snatched the coins, Anthony pulled out his pocket knife and cut through the ropes binding the girl's wrists. She stared at him with wide, frightened eyes as she rubbed her raw skin. The crowd began to disperse, disappointed now that the spectacle was over. You're free, Anthony told her quietly. I'll not own another human being. That paper means nothing to me except that it keeps you safe from him. He nodded toward the trader, who was already stumbling toward the nearest saloon. The girl, Madison Pike, according to the bill of sale he'd already determined to burn, looked at him as if she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. "Free," she whispered, her voice rough from crying. Anthony nodded. He shrugged out of his coat and wrapped it around her trembling shoulders. "There's a Quaker mission outside of town. Good people there. They'll help you find your way." Madison clutched the coat around herself, but didn't move. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you help me?" Anthony thought of his own wife, gone these 5 years now, and how she'd always said that faith without works was dead. "Because it was right," he said simply. "My wagon's just over there. I can take you to the mission, if you're willing." She glanced around nervously, then nodded. Anthony led her to his wagon, helping her up onto the wooden seat. He could feel curious eyes watching them, but he kept his movements deliberate and proper. Let them look. He knew in his heart he was doing the Lord's work. As he climbed up beside her, Madison spoke so softly he almost missed it. "Thank you." Anthony clicked to his horses and turned the wagon toward the mission. The sun was setting now, painting the Kansas sky in shades of purple and gold. He'd lost his chance to trade his produce, and $20 was no small sum for an Amish farmer. But as he heard Madison's quiet prayers of gratitude beside him, he knew he'd gained something far more valuable than silver or seed. The wagon wheels groaned against the frozen ground as Anthony guided his team northward. The late afternoon wind cut across the prairie like a knife, whistling through the tall grass and making the horses' manes dance. Beside him, Madison huddled deeper into his coat, her eyes fixed on the horizon. The silence between them stretched long, broken only by her occasional whispered "thank you" when the wagon hit a smooth patch of trail. Anthony kept his eyes on the road, mindful of the proper distance between them on the narrow seat. The sun hung low in the winter sky, casting long shadows across the frost-covered plains. After an hour's travel, the sound of running water caught Anthony's attention. A small stream cut through the prairie, its edges rimmed with ice, but its center still flowing dark and clear. He pulled the wagon to a stop. "We should rest the horses," he said, his voice gentle. "And you must be thirsty." Madison nodded, accepting his help down from the wagon with trembling hands. Her feet barely made a sound on the frozen ground as she followed him to the stream's edge. Anthony filled a tin cup from his supplies and offered it to her. She drank deeply, the water dripping from her chin. Reaching into his lunch pail, Anthony pulled out a loaf of brown bread and a wedge of cheese. He cut thick slices of each, handling the knife carefully so as not to frighten her. "Eat," he said, holding out the simple meal. "It will help keep you warm." Madison took the food with murmured thanks, eating slowly at first, then with increasing hunger. Anthony busied himself checking the horses, giving her privacy to eat her fill. "I'm 18, she said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Anthony turned, careful to keep his movements slow. "My parents died in a fire when I was small. My uncle—" She swallowed hard, crumbling a piece of bread between her fingers. "He took me in, but when the preacher's son started calling, things changed." Anthony stood very still, his heart heavy with understanding. The world could be cruel to young women alone, even in God's country. The son, he wanted things I couldn't give. Madison's voice shook. "When I refused him, he told everyone I'd led him astray. My uncle believed him, said I was worthless now, except for what he could get for me." A single tear rolled down her cheek. "That's how I ended up in Dodge City." "You did nothing wrong," Anthony said firmly, his quiet voice carrying over the wind. "That man's sin is not yours to bear." The sky had darkened while they talked, heavy clouds rolling in from the north. The first snowflakes began to fall, thick and fast, dancing in the strengthening wind. Anthony studied the weather with growing concern. The Quaker mission was still hours away, and night was coming on fast. "The storm's getting worse," he said, more to himself than Madison. His farm lay closer, perhaps an hour's ride, but taking an unmarried woman there. The thought of the gossip it would cause made him shift uncomfortably, yet leaving her to freeze would be a far greater sin. Anthony bowed his head, his lips moving in silent prayer. "Lord, guide my path. Show me how to do what's right without bringing shame." "We'll have to wait out the storm at my farm," he said finally, helping Madison back into the wagon. "It's not proper, but it's better than risking the trail tonight." The snow fell harder as they drove on, the wind howling across the open prairie. Madison huddled closer to Anthony's side, seeking warmth, and he couldn't find it in his heart to move away. The darkness grew deeper, broken only by the lantern swaying from the wagon's frame. At last, the shape of Anthony's farmhouse emerged from the gloom. It was a solid structure of hewn logs, with a barn close by and a stack of firewood under the eaves. Anthony helped Madison down, leading her quickly inside while the horses stamped in the growing drifts. The house was cold and dark, but Anthony soon had a fire blazing in the hearth. He moved efficiently, lighting lamps and pulling out extra blankets, all while keeping a respectful distance from his unexpected guest. Madison sank down before the fire, still wrapped in his coat, as if it could shield her from more than just the cold. "You'll be safe here," Anthony assured her, setting a cup of hot tea beside her. "No one will harm you under my roof." Madison clutched his coat tighter around her shoulders, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "Thank you," she whispered again, but this time the words held more than simple gratitude. They carried the weight of true sanctuary found. Anthony watched as she slowly relaxed in the fire's warmth, her eyelids growing heavy. Soon she was asleep, his coat drawn around her like armor against the world's cruelty. The wind howled outside, but in here, for this moment at least, there was peace. Morning crept through the frost-covered windows, painting the cabin's wooden walls in pale golden light. Anthony stood at his iron cookstove, stirring a pot of thick porridge while stealing glances at Madison, who slept curled near the banked hearth. His coat still wrapped around her slight frame, rising and falling with each breath. Clara peered around the doorframe from her small bedroom, her blue eyes wide with curiosity. She watched the stranger sleeping in their home, one hand twisting her long brown braid. Anthony beckoned her over with a gentle motion. "Come help me with breakfast, Clara," he whispered. The 12-year-old padded across the plank floor in her wool stockings. She reached for the honey pot, while Anthony spooned the steaming porridge into 3 wooden bowls. The familiar routine felt different somehow, weighted with the presence of their unexpected guest. Madison stirred as the smell of food filled the cabin. She sat up slowly, wincing, and Anthony's heart clenched at what the morning light revealed. Purple bruises bloomed along her jawline, disappearing beneath her collar. Her dress, hidden by his coat through the night, was torn at the shoulder and stained with mud. "Good morning," Clara said softly, offering Madison a bowl of porridge drizzled with honey. "I'm Clara." Madison accepted the bowl with trembling hands. "Thank you. I'm Madison." Her voice was rough from sleep and something deeper, fear or exhaustion, Anthony couldn't tell which. "Uncle Anthony makes the best porridge," Clara continued, settling cross-legged on the floor nearby. "He puts cinnamon in it sometimes, when we can get it from the store." A ghost of a smile touched Madison's lips. "It smells wonderful." She took a careful spoonful, then another, color slowly returning to her pale cheeks. After breakfast, Madison stood shakily. "Please, let me help with the dishes or the other chores. I know how to cook and clean, and I can sew, too." Anthony shook his head firmly. "You need rest, nothing more. The work will keep." "But I can't just sit here," Madison protested. "After all you've done." "What I've done requires no payment," Anthony interrupted, his voice gentle but firm. "Rest. Heal. That's all I ask." The morning passed quietly. Clara showed Madison her small collection of books, pointing out her favorite Bible stories while Anthony tended to the animals. Around noon, the sound of approaching horses drew him from the barn. 2 men rode up to the fence, Elder Miller and Elder Stoltzfus from the community church. Their dark clothes and stern expressions matched the heavy gray sky above. "Brother Yoder," Elder Miller called, not dismounting. "We heard talk in town about you bringing home a woman." Anthony straightened, brushing straw from his clothes. "She needed help. I couldn't leave her to freeze." "Outsiders bring ruin," Elder Stoltzfus said sharply. "You know this. The English world corrupts all it touches." "She's hardly more than a girl," Anthony replied, his quiet voice carrying an edge of steel. "She was being sold like cattle in Dodge City. Would you have me turn away when someone needs Christian charity?" The elders exchanged dark looks. "Your reputation is at stake, Brother Yoder," Elder Miller warned, "and the reputation of our community. Send her to the mission as soon as the weather clears." They rode away without waiting for his response, leaving Anthony standing in the trampled snow. Their words echoed in his mind as he returned to his chores, doubt gnawing at his certainty. As evening approached, Anthony built up the hearth fire and hung a sheet across one corner of the main room. Madison had asked to wash, and he'd heated water for her, setting it behind the makeshift screen with soap and a clean towel. He was reaching for more firewood when he accidentally stepped past the sheet's edge. Madison stood with her back turned, her torn dress pooled at her feet. Anthony froze, horror-struck not by her nakedness but by the story written on her skin. Long scars crossed her back, some old and white, others newer, angry red against her pale flesh. They spoke of years of cruelty, of pain inflicted by those who should have protected her. Madison whirled at his presence, clutching the towel to her chest. Her eyes met his for one burning moment, fear and shame and something like defiance all mixed together. Anthony stumbled backward, knocking over the water bucket in his haste, to retreat. "Forgive me," he gasped, his face burning. "I didn't mean, I'm sorry." He fled to the porch, his heart pounding. The cold air bit at his face as he leaned against the rough wall, trying to steady his breathing. Those scars haunted him, but something else troubled his spirit too. The way his heart had lurched at seeing her, a feeling he hadn't experienced since his wife's death years ago. "Lord help me," he whispered into the gathering dark. "Show me the right path." Inside, he could hear Clara's voice reading scripture aloud, probably trying to ease the awkward moment. Anthony remained outside until his racing thoughts calmed, watching his breath cloud in the winter air. The next morning dawned bitter cold, with frost etching delicate patterns across the window panes. Anthony hitched his horse to the wagon, loading several sacks of wheat that needed grinding. The mill lay 3 miles south, past the cluster of Amish farms that made up their small community. "I'll return before midday," he told Clara and Madison, who sat at the kitchen table sharing a pot of tea. "Bar the door while I'm gone." The wagon wheels creaked over the frozen ground as he made his way down the narrow dirt road. At the mill, the usual quiet industry of the place felt different. Men who normally greeted him warmly now turned away, speaking in hushed voices. Anthony caught fragments of their whispers as he unloaded his wheat. Bought himself some company in Dodge City, they say. Living in sin with an English girl. Shame on a God-fearing man. Anthony's jaw tightened, but he kept his peace, focusing on his task. The miller, usually chatty, spoke only the necessary words about the grinding. The flour's familiar dusty smell filled the air as Anthony waited, trying to ignore the sideways glances and muttered judgments. When he returned home, he found Madison in the barn, her dress covered by one of his old work shirts. She was carefully milking their goats, her hands moving with practiced ease, while Clara watched from a hay bale. "I hope you don't mind," Madison said quickly, seeing his expression. "I couldn't sit idle another moment. The goats needed milking, and Clara showed me where everything was kept." Anthony studied her face. It held more color today, and some of the haunted look had left her eyes. "You've done this before?" "At the orphanage," she nodded. "We had 3 goats. I helped care for them every morning." He considered for a moment, then gave a slight nod. "Very well, but don't overtax yourself." "I also mended your spare shirt," Madison added, gesturing to neat stitches on a work shirt hanging by the door. "The seam was coming apart. It's the least I can do after—" Her voice trailed off. "You owe me nothing," Anthony reminded her, but seeing the determined set of her chin, he added, "Though we're grateful for the help." Throughout the afternoon, Madison moved carefully around their small home, finding ways to be useful. Her presence gradually began to feel less intrusive, more natural, as she worked quietly alongside them. She helped Clara with her reading lessons and learned where they kept the dishes and cooking tools. As evening approached, Clara pulled out the old hymnal her mother had left behind. "Will you sing with me?" she asked Madison. "Uncle Anthony says I need practice, but he only knows the men's parts." Madison hesitated, then sat beside Clara on the bench. Anthony watched them from his chair by the fire as Clara's small finger traced the lines of amazing grace. Madison's voice, when she joined in, was sweet and clear despite its trembling start. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me." The familiar words filled the cabin, and Anthony's chest tightened. Sarah, his wife, had sung this same hymn while working in their garden or rocking Clara to sleep after his brother's death. The memories rose up like physical things. Sarah's laugh, the way she'd touch his shoulder when passing, her quiet strength in times of trouble. Outside, snow began falling again, thick flakes catching the lamplight through the windows. The two inside continued singing, their voices blending on the old words of hope and redemption. Clara's high, clear notes wove with Madison's deeper alto, creating something both beautiful and painful to hear. Later, after Clara had gone to bed, Madison sat by the fire, working on more mending. Anthony noticed her hands shaking slightly as she pushed the needle through the fabric. "The elders came by again today," she said softly, not looking up. "While you were at the mill, I heard them talking outside." Anthony set down his Bible. "What did they say?" "That I should go to the mission house." Her fingers stilled on the cloth. "But I can't face men of the cloth again. Not after—" She swallowed hard. "The preacher's son, he said God wanted— He tried to—" Her voice broke. "What he did was wrong," Anthony said firmly. "God never sanctions cruelty or force." Madison's eyes glistened in the firelight. "How can you be so sure? Everyone who spoke of faith to me used it like a weapon." Anthony was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "True faith is like this firelight," he said finally. "It warms, it guides, it comforts. It doesn't burn or destroy. Not all who claim to speak for God truly do so." Madison considered this, her fingers absently tracing the fabric in her lap. Your faith seems different, quieter. More like—" She paused, searching for words. "More like daily bread than sharp stones." The snow continued falling outside, deepening the drifts around the cabin. Inside, the fire crackled softly as they sat in companionable silence, each lost in thought. Anthony noticed that Madison's shoulders had relaxed slightly, her movements becoming less guarded. His own grief, so long frozen in his chest, felt somehow less rigid, as if it too was beginning to thaw in the quiet warmth of their shared evening. The next morning, the wind rose to a piercing howl. Snow whipped past the windows in thick white sheets, obscuring everything beyond the porch. Anthony struggled through the deepening drifts to check on the livestock, Madison insisting on helping despite his protests. "I won't let you face this alone," she said, wrapping herself in his spare wool coat. Together they fought their way to the barn, where the animals huddled together for warmth. Inside, Madison moved with quiet efficiency, distributing hay and fresh water. "The goats seem anxious," she noted, stroking one's ear. "Perhaps they sense this storm will last." She was right. For 3 days the blizzard raged, trapping them inside except for necessary trips to the barn. Madison filled the hours with industry, darning socks by lamplight and teaching Clara to card wool. Her nimble fingers restored torn shirt collars and patched worn quilts, while Anthony split extra firewood and monitored their dwindling supplies. On the second evening, smoke began filling the cabin. Anthony climbed onto the roof to check the chimney while Madison passed up tools. The bitter wind cut through their clothes as they worked together to clear the blocked flue. "Careful," Madison called, as Anthony's boot slipped on the icy shingles. She steadied the ladder, her face pinched with worry. Finally, Anthony managed to dislodge the obstruction, a mass of creosote and frozen snow. It came free suddenly, showering them both with black soot. Madison's startled yelp turned into laughter at the sight of Anthony's blackened face. "You look like you've been wrestling with the devil himself," she said, wiping tears from her eyes. Anthony couldn't help but smile, noticing how the soot had turned her pale hair nearly as dark as his. "And you look like you've been helping him," he replied, surprising himself with the jest. Their shared laughter echoed across the snow-buried yard, a warm sound in the frigid air. Inside, they cleaned up by the fire, while Clara giggled at their appearance. For a moment, the easy fellowship felt almost like— Anthony stopped the thought before it could fully form, reminding himself that such comfort was temporary. The third morning, Clara wouldn't wake for breakfast. Her small face was flushed, her breathing quick and shallow. Anthony's heart clenched with fear. He'd lost his brother and sister-in-law to fever 2 winters past. "She's burning up," Madison said, laying a cool hand on Clara's forehead. "Do you have any herbs? Willow bark? Boneset?" Anthony nodded toward Sarah's old medicine chest. Madison quickly sorted through the dried plants, her movements sure and practiced. "We used these at the orphanage when the little ones fell ill," she explained, measuring portions into a pot of water. Throughout the day, Madison tended Clara with gentle determination. She brewed healing teas, placed cool cloths on the girl's forehead, and made poultices of mustard seed to draw out the fever. Her quiet hymns seemed to soothe Clara's restless sleep. Anthony watched them from his chair, supposedly reading his Bible, but instead studying how Madison's hands moved with such tender confidence. How she smoothed Clara's hair back with the same loving care Sarah once had. The sight stirred something in his chest. Gratitude, yes, but also a warmth he dared not name. "Lord, grant me wisdom," he prayed silently. "Let me not mistake your providence for personal desire." By evening, Clara's fever had broken. She sat up in bed, weak but smiling, while Madison spooned her fresh broth. The storm outside was finally weakening, its fury spent. When morning came, the world had transformed. Pristine snow blanketed everything in sight, smoothing the rough edges of fence posts and wagon wheels into gentle curves. Sunlight sparked off ice crystals, making the familiar landscape seem almost holy in its quiet beauty. Inside the cabin, last night's fire still warmed the air. Madison hummed as she kneaded bread dough, flour dusting her arms. Clara sat wrapped in quilts by the window, reading aloud from her primer. The scene held such simple rightness that Anthony had to turn away, his throat tight with emotions he couldn't safely examine. Yet the warmth remained, settling into the corners of their temporary home like a tangible thing. It lingered in shared glances over morning prayers, in the way Clara reached for Madison's hand when walking to the barn, in the rhythm of their days now falling into familiar patterns. Anthony felt it in his bones, this sense of something healing, something growing, something as fresh and clean as the new fallen snow outside. The first warm breeze of March whistled through bare branches, bringing with it the promise of spring. Patches of earth emerged from melting snow like dark islands in a white sea. Anthony watched from his barn door as water dripped steadily from the eaves, each drop carrying winter's grip away with it. Madison stood in the dooryard, face turned toward the strengthening sun. These past weeks, color had returned to her cheeks, and her steps had grown lighter. She spent mornings helping Clara with her lessons, and afternoons tending to the early seedlings they'd started in the window boxes. The sight of her gentle contentment made Anthony's heart both full and uneasy. He knew the peace couldn't last forever. The thunder of approaching hooves broke the quiet afternoon. Anthony recognized the distinctive black buggy of Bishop Reuben Hostetler long before it reached the gate. His stomach tightened as the bishop's tall figure emerged, stern face set like flint beneath his broad-brimmed hat. "Brother Yoder," the bishop said, his voice carrying across the muddy yard. "I trust I find you well?" Anthony wiped his palms on his trousers and stepped forward to greet him. "Yeah, Bishop. God has been merciful this winter." The bishop's eyes darted to where Madison stood frozen by the chicken coop. "Indeed, though some might say you test that mercy, harboring an English girl these many weeks. The community talks, Anthony." "She needed shelter," Anthony said quietly. "Would you have had me turn her away?" "There are proper channels for charity." The bishop's words cut like ice. "The mission house, for one. This arrangement tests the bounds of community purity, sets tongues wagging, makes others question your judgment." Anthony saw Madison's shoulders stiffen. Before he could respond, she turned and fled into the house, the door closing behind her with a soft thud that seemed to echo in his chest. "She is a child of God, same as any of us," Anthony said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I answer to him first." The bishop's expression hardened. "You answer to your community, brother. Remember that." He turned back to his buggy without another word, leaving Anthony standing in the thawing mud. Inside the house, Anthony found Madison huddled by the hearth, tears streaming down her face. Clara sat beside her, small hand patting Madison's shoulder in confusion. "I'm sorry," Madison whispered. "I'm destroying everything you've built here. Your standing, your reputation." Anthony knelt before her, his heart aching at her distress. "No gossip can outweigh what conscience demands," he said firmly. "God knows the truth of why you're here." Madison's tears fell faster. "But they don't know. They think terrible things. About both of us." She drew a shuddering breath. "Maybe it's time I told you everything. Why I was in Dodge City that day. Clara seemed to sense the gravity of the moment. Without being asked, she retreated upstairs to her room, leaving them alone by the dying fire. "It wasn't just that I refused him. The preacher's son," Madison began, her voice barely above a whisper. "He cornered me in the church storage room after Sunday service, said no one would believe me over him anyway." Her hands twisted in her skirt. "When I fought him off and ran, he told everyone I'd tried to seduce him. My uncle." Her voice broke. "My uncle saw an opportunity, said he could make the scandal go away if the preacher's family paid enough. When they wouldn't, he decided to sell me instead. Said at least he'd get some profit from my shame." Anthony's fingers curled into fists, his knuckles white with rage. The hypocrisy of it all, men of supposed faith using God's name to destroy an innocent girl, made his blood boil. Yet beneath the anger lay a deeper sorrow for all she'd endured. "I wouldn't let them break me," Madison continued. "Even when my uncle sold me to that traitor, even when he—" She touched her shoulder where Anthony knew the scars lay hidden. "But sometimes I wonder if they were right about me being worthless." "No." Anthony's voice came out rough with emotion. "They were wrong. About everything." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and covered her trembling hands with his own. "I promise you this. You will never be used that way again. Not while I draw breath." Madison's fingers tightened around his. "I believe you," she whispered. "You're the first person who's ever kept their word to me." They sat in silence as the fire crackled low, their joined hands a bridge across the pain of the past. Outside, the spring thaw continued its quiet work, breaking winter's bonds one drop at a time. Inside, something else was thawing too. The frozen places in both their hearts where trust had withered and died. April settled over the prairie like a gentle sigh, bringing with it longer days and tender green shoots pushing through dark soil. Madison spent her mornings in Anthony's garden, kneeling beside Clara as they planted neat rows of vegetables. The earth felt alive beneath her fingers, rich with promise. "Look." Clara held up a fat earthworm, giggling as it wriggled. "God's little helper, that's what Papa used to call them." Madison smiled, watching the girl's delight. "Your papa was right. They make the soil sweet for growing things." She sat back on her heels, wiping her brow with her sleeve. The spring sun warmed her face, and for the first time in months, maybe years, laughter bubbled up from deep inside her, pure and unguarded. Clara joined in, their shared mirth floating across the freshly turned garden beds. From where he worked on the old barn's roof, Anthony paused his hammering to watch them. The sound of their happiness made his chest tighten with an unfamiliar ache. "The ladder needs steadying," he called down, trying to focus on the task at hand. "These shingles won't lay themselves." Madison rose, brushing dirt from her apron. "I'll help," she offered, moving to grip the wooden rungs. Her hands were sure and strong from weeks of farm work. "Clara, mind you don't let those seedlings dry out." The girl nodded seriously, returning to her careful planting while Madison braced the ladder. Anthony climbed higher, carrying fresh shingles. The old barn needed much repair after winter's harsh winds had torn away sections of the roof. "Hand me that hammer?" Anthony reached down. Their fingers brushed as Madison passed the tool up, sending a jolt through both of them. He nearly missed the next nail, distracted by the warmth of that brief touch. They worked in companionable silence, the steady rhythm of his hammering mixing with bird song and Clara's distant humming. Madison kept the ladder firm, her presence below both reassuring and unsettling. Every so often their eyes would meet when he glanced down to ask for another tool, and something unspoken passed between them. As evening approached, they gathered around the kitchen table for a simple supper of bread and stew. Clara, her face glowing in the lamplight, folded her hands to say grace. Instead of the usual prayer, she recited carefully from memory. Be kind to one another, tender-hearted, forgiving one another, as God in Christ forgave you. Madison's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. She set it, down slowly, eyes bright with sudden tears. I never knew what safety felt like, she said softly, looking at Anthony. Not until you showed me. Thank you for teaching me that not all men abuse their strength. Anthony's throat tightened. He nodded, unable to speak past the emotion that welled up inside him. Clara reached across the table to squeeze Madison's hand, offering comfort with a child's pure instinct. Later that night, after the dishes were cleared and Clara had gone up to bed, Anthony sat at his desk by candlelight. He pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and began writing to the Quaker mission house. His pen scratched across the page as he described Madison's situation, asking if they might receive her with the dignity and respect she deserved. But halfway through, his hand stilled. The thought of sending her away, even to good people who would treat her kindly, made his heart heavy as lead. He watched the candle flame dance, casting shadows on the unfinished letter. These past weeks had brought such change to his quiet home. Madison's presence had filled empty corners with warmth he'd thought lost forever after his wife's death. Her gentle way with Clara, her willing hands at every task, her quiet strength in the face of all she'd suffered. These things had worked their way deep into his daily life. He looked down at the letter, seeing the words blur before his eyes. Duty told him to finish it, to do what the community would consider proper. But something else, something that felt dangerously like tenderness, made him fold the paper and tuck it away in his desk drawer instead. Outside his window, spring peepers sang their evening chorus. The sound reminded him of other spring nights, long ago, when he'd courted his wife under the watchful eyes of their families. Everything had been proper then, ordained by tradition and blessed by the community. This growing feeling for Madison was different, complicated by her past, by his position, by the watching eyes of neighbors who wouldn't understand. Anthony bowed his head, seeking guidance in prayer. But even as he asked for clarity, he knew his heart had already begun to choose its path, one that led away from duty's well-worn road and toward something both frightening and precious in its possibility. The letter remained unfinished in his drawer, a testimony to the conflict between what he ought to do and what his heart whispered might be right. Outside, the spring night deepened, full of the promise of growing things and change yet to come. The spring morning dawned clear and cool as Anthony hitched his horse to the buggy. Sunday service always brought the community together, though today his stomach knotted with apprehension. He adjusted his black hat and straightened his plain coat, knowing every eye would be watching. The meeting house stood weather-worn, but dignified against the pale blue sky. Anthony tied his horse beside the others, noting how conversations hushed as he approached. Sisters in their white caps turned away. Brothers gave him a wide berth. Only young Samuel Fisher, barely 16, dared a friendly nod. Inside, sunlight streamed through simple windows, falling across rough-hewn benches where the congregation sat divided, men on one side, women on the other. Anthony took his usual seat near the middle, feeling the weight of unspoken judgment press down like a heavy blanket. Elder Stoltzfus rose to lead the opening hymn. The familiar German words filled the room, but Anthony heard the strain in some voices, the deliberate silence of others who would normally sing beside him. He kept his eyes forward, focusing on the worn Bible before him. After scripture reading and prayer, Elder Brenneman cleared his throat. Brothers and sisters, we must address a matter of growing concern. His stern gaze fixed on Anthony. Some among us harbor those who would bring worldly shame upon our community. Murmurs rippled through the gathering. Anthony's hands tightened on his knees, but he held steady. The English girl living in Brother Yoder's house, Elder Kruger added, his voice sharp with disapproval. Purchased at auction, we hear. Such arrangements have no place among God's people. She must be sent away, declared Brother Miller, standing abruptly, his face flushed red above his beard. For the good of all, for the purity of our ways, we cannot allow this scandal to continue. The word scandal cracked through the air like a whip. Anthony felt heat rise in his chest, not from shame, but from a righteous anger he'd never known before. Slowly, deliberately, he rose to his feet. If we turn away those who need mercy, he said, his quiet voice carrying in the sudden silence, then we deny the very grace that saves us all. He looked around the room, meeting hostile stares and uncertain glances alike. Madison Pike came to us broken by men who claimed to serve God. She works honestly, prays earnestly, and asks only for safety while she heals. The community must be protected, Elder Brenneman began, but Anthony continued, his voice growing stronger. If grace cannot live among us, then God himself is a stranger here. The words hung in the still air like thunder before lightning. Women's hands flew to their mouths. Men shifted uncomfortably. The elders stood frozen, their authority challenged not by defiance, but by simple truth. No one spoke for long moments. Then old Minister Zook, who rarely spoke at meetings anymore, lifted his trembling hand. The stranger, he said softly, maybe an angel unaware. We would do well to remember this. The service ended earlier than usual, the benediction rushed and uncertain. Outside, Anthony untied his horse with steady hands, though his heart still raced. Several men passed by, some nodding with newfound respect. Others, like Brother Miller, glared openly before turning away. Young Samuel Fisher approached briefly, touching Anthony's arm. You spoke truth, the old boy whispered, then hurried away. The ride home seemed longer than usual, giving Anthony time to ponder the morning's events. He'd never meant to challenge the elders openly, but neither could he stay silent while they condemned without understanding. The scent of fresh-baked bread greeted him as he approached his farm, and his heart lightened. Inside, he found Madison pulling a golden loaf from the oven. Her face glowed with pride as she set it on the cooling rack. I wanted to thank you, she said softly, for everything. Clara helped me with the recipe. The girl beamed from her perch by the window, flour still dusting her apron. There was a discussion at service today, Anthony said carefully, watching Madison's expression. About you staying here. Her face fell, hands clutching her apron. They want me gone. Some did, he admitted, but I told them that grace must live among us, or we deny God himself. Madison's eyes filled with tears. She sank into a chair, shoulders shaking. You defended me? Publicly? Even after all the talk, all the trouble I've brought to your door? You've brought no trouble, Anthony said firmly. Only light and healing to this home. He pulled out a chair and sat across from her. The truth needs no defense, only speaking. Tears rolled down Madison's cheeks as she reached across the table, touching his hand briefly. Thank you, she whispered, for seeing me as God does. Worth saving. Clara came to stand beside Madison, wrapping small arms around her shoulders. The three of them sat in the warm kitchen, the fresh bread filling the air with its homely scent, while outside the spring wind carried away the last bitter chill of winter. The week after Anthony's stand at church brought gentle spring days filled with promise. Madison and Clara planted peas along the garden fence while Anthony repaired winter's damage to the barn. The rhythm of simple work and honest fellowship had begun to heal old wounds. Then hoofbeats thundered up the lane. Anthony straightened from mending a fence post, squinting against the morning sun. A lone rider approached, kicking up dust, his fine black coat marking him as a town man. Something in the stranger's bearing made Anthony's shoulders tense. "Clara," he called quietly to where the girls worked in the garden. "Take Madison inside now." Madison looked up, her face going pale as she recognized the rider. Her fingers clutched the garden trowel like a shield. Clara tugged at her sleeve, but Madison seemed frozen, staring at the approaching figure. The rider reined his horse to a stop, looking down at Anthony with cold eyes set in a handsome face. His clothes spoke of wealth, but his smile held no warmth. "So this is where she's been hiding," he drawled, "behind an Amish farmer's skirts." "Jacob Wills," Madison whispered, her voice trembling. "The preacher's son, the man who had destroyed her life." Anthony moved deliberately, positioning himself between Jacob and the women. "This is private property," he said evenly. "State your business or leave." Jacob's smile widened, showing teeth. Now, is that any way to treat a man of God's son?" He swung down from his horse, boots striking dust. "I've come about the girl. There are matters between us that need settling." "The only matter here," Anthony replied, "is that you're not welcome on my land." Jacob's face darkened. "That's not your decision to make. She belongs to no one but God," Anthony cut in, his voice sharp as a blade. "And he has led her here for protection." "Protection?" Jacob sneered, glancing past Anthony to where Madison stood trembling. "Is that what you call it? Taking in a fallen woman, keeping her in your house?" His lips curved cruelly. "The community must be so proud of your charity." Anthony felt righteous anger rise in his chest, but kept his voice steady. "You speak of charity while showing none, of God while doing the devil's work." He took a step forward. "I know what you did to her." Something ugly flashed across Jacob's features. "You know nothing," he spat. "That girl is a liar and a temptress, and I'll see her answer for her sins." He straightened his fine coat. "I'll return with the law. We'll see what the sheriff thinks about an Amish man keeping a young woman he purchased at auction." "The truth will speak louder than your lies," Anthony said firmly. Jacob's hand dropped to his gun belt. "We'll see whose truth they believe, a respected preacher's son or a primitive farmer harboring a whore." The crude word cracked like a whip. Anthony's fists clenched, but he held his ground. "Leave now," he commanded, "before you do something even your father's influence can't hide." For a long moment, Jacob stood rigid with rage. Then he swung back onto his horse, yanking the reins. "This isn't finished," he snarled. "Not by far." He spurred his mount, spraying dirt as he galloped away. Only when the dust settled did Anthony turn to find Madison collapsed in Clara's arms, sobbing. He hurried to them, helping Clara guide Madison into the house. They sat her at the kitchen table while Clara fetched water. "He'll bring them here," Madison choked out. "They'll believe him. They always do." Her fingers twisted in her apron. "I should go. I'm bringing nothing but trouble to your home." "No." Anthony's voice was firm, but gentle. He sat beside her, taking her trembling hands in his work-roughened ones. "You are not trouble. You are a child of God seeking refuge from evil." He reached for his worn Bible, opening to a familiar passage. "Listen to these words. 'The Lord is my rock and my fortress and my deliverer, my God, my strength, in whom I will trust.'" Madison's tears slowed as Anthony's steady voice filled the kitchen with ancient promises of protection. Clara pressed close to her side, small hand patting Madison's arm. "But your reputation," Madison whispered. "Your standing in the community. You'll lose everything because of me." Anthony closed the Bible softly. "Some things matter more than reputation," he said. "Justice, truth, protecting those who cannot protect themselves." He met her tear-stained gaze. "I made you a promise of safety. I mean to keep it, whatever the cost. Even against the law?" "Man's law is not always God's law," Anthony replied, "and I answer to a higher court than any sheriff's." He squeezed her hands gently. "You are not alone anymore." Madison bowed her head, fresh tears falling. But these were different from before. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing in me when no one else would." Through the window, the spring sun painted the kitchen in soft gold, while outside the wind carried distant thunder. A storm was coming. But inside this simple house, 3 souls drew strength from each other, preparing to face whatever darkness approached with the light of truth and faith as their shield. The letter arrived on a bitter morning, carried by a trader passing through. Anthony read it twice, his face growing grave. Madison watched from where she mended by the hearth, noting how his shoulders tensed. "Bad news?" she asked softly. Anthony folded the paper slowly. "The Quaker mission in Topeka. There was a fire. A lantern fell during the night." He paused, searching for gentle words. "The building burned to the ground." Madison's fingers stilled on her needlework. "Was anyone hurt?" "No deaths, thanks be to God, but the mission is destroyed." He didn't mention his unsent letter to them about Madison, now rendered meaningless. Clara brought them tea, but Madison barely touched hers. That evening, she went to bed early, her face troubled. Through the thin walls, Anthony heard her weeping. The next day brought darker tidings. 2 women from the settlement visited, bearing sympathy bread and poisoned words. "Such a tragedy about the mission," one clucked, eyeing Madison, "though some say it was God's judgment on those who shelter unfortunates." "Sister Ruth says it's what happens when good folks stray from righteous paths," added the other. "Harboring sinners brings divine punishment." Anthony sent them away, but their words lingered like smoke. Madison grew quieter with each passing hour, her eyes haunted. At supper she barely ate, starting at every creak of the house timbers. "Don't let their cruel gossip trouble you," Anthony told her. "God's love is bigger than their fear." Madison nodded, but her smile didn't reach her eyes. That night, she sat long by the fire, after the others went to bed, staring into the flames as if seeking answers there. Before dawn, Anthony woke to Clara shaking his shoulder. "Uncle Anthony, Madison's gone." He dressed hurriedly, his heart pounding. In the kitchen, he found a note in Madison's careful hand. "Dear Anthony and Clara, I bring only trouble and judgment to those who show me kindness. The mission burning proves God's wrath follows me. I cannot bear to bring more shame to your home and community. Please forgive me for all the pain I've caused. Thank you for showing me what a real Christian heart looks like. I will never forget your mercy. Madison." Anthony crumpled the paper in his fist, fighting despair. Outside, fresh snow had fallen in the night, but clear tracks led away from the house toward the eastern woods. "Stay here," he told Clara. "Keep the fire strong. We'll need its warmth when we return." He saddled his horse quickly, ignoring the bite of the wind. The mare's hooves crunched through the crusty snow as they followed Madison's trail. She had perhaps 2 hours' head start, on foot in the bitter cold. The tracks wandered, showing her uncertainty. Here and there he found places where she had stopped to rest, small hollows in the snow. His throat tightened, imagining her alone and frightened, believing herself cursed by God. The wind rose as morning broke, beginning to erase the trail. Anthony urged his horse faster, scanning the white landscape for any sign of movement. The temperature was dropping. A storm approached from the north. If he didn't find her soon... "Madison," he called, his voice almost lost in the wind. "Madison!" The horse plowed through deepening drifts. Anthony's hands grew numb on the reins, but he pressed on. He had promised to protect her. He had promised. A dark shape ahead made him rein up sharply. There, huddled against a fallen log, half covered in snow. His heart stopped. "Madison!" Anthony leaped from the saddle, stumbling through the drifts. She didn't move as he approached. "Please, Lord," he prayed. "Please." When he reached her, Madison's eyes fluttered open. Her lips were blue with cold, her dress crusted with ice. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I only bring trouble." "No," Anthony said firmly, wrapping his heavy coat around her. "You bring light to our home. Clara needs you. He stopped himself. "God led you to us for a purpose. Running away serves no one. But the mission, the judgment, was an accident, nothing more." He helped her stand on shaking legs. "God doesn't punish through fire and storm. He heals through love and mercy." Anthony lifted her onto his horse, mounting behind her. "Let me take you home." Madison leaned back against him, too exhausted to argue. As they rode, the first snowflakes of the coming storm began to fall. "I was so afraid," she murmured, "of bringing you harm." "Perfect love casts out fear," Anthony quoted softly, "and you are not alone anymore." They rode on through the swirling snow, his arms steady around her, guiding them home to where Clara waited with warm fire and open heart. The storm grew stronger, but they faced it together, leaving guilt and despair behind in the drifting white. Anthony urged his horse through the deepening snow, following Madison's meandering tracks. The wind cut across the prairie like a razor, each gust carrying needle-sharp ice that stung his face. His breath came out in white clouds as he scanned the endless, white expanse before him. "Madison," he called again, though the howling wind tore the words from his mouth. His horse trudged forward, steam rising from its flanks. The morning sun cast long shadows across the drifts, making it harder to distinguish her trail. Anthony's hands, stiff with cold inside his leather gloves, gripped the reins tighter. Ice had formed in his beard, crackling when he turned his head to survey the landscape. Mile after frozen mile stretched behind him now. The tracks showed where Madison had stumbled repeatedly, her steps becoming more erratic. Anthony's heart clenched at each such sign. She'd been out here for hours in nothing but her dress and shawl. "Lord, guide me to her," he whispered, the words catching in his throat. The creek lay ahead, its banks deep with snow. Anthony nearly missed the dark shape huddled against a fallen cottonwood. His horse nickered softly as if sensing his sudden alertness. "Madison!" He leapt from the saddle, boots crunching through the crusty surface of the snow. Each step was a battle as he plowed through drifts nearly to his knees. She lay curled on her side, partially sheltered by the log. Her dress had frozen stiff, and her lips held a frightening bluish tinge. Snow dusted her eyelashes like frost on morning grass. "Madison?" Anthony breathed, dropping to his knees beside her. His trembling fingers found her neck, searching for a pulse. It fluttered there, weak but present. Her eyes flickered open, glazed with cold and confusion. "Anthony?" "I'm here." He shrugged off his heavy wool coat and wrapped it around her. "I'm taking you home." When he tried to lift her, the metal dress pins at her collar had frozen so cold they burned his bare skin. Anthony barely noticed the pain. Madison felt light in his arms, like a child, her head lolling against his shoulder. "I'm sorry," she murmured, her words slurring. "Didn't want to cause more trouble." "Hush now," Anthony said gently. "Save your strength." The walk back to his horse seemed endless. The wind had picked up, driving snow sideways across the prairie. Anthony's shirt offered little protection against the cold, but the exercise of carrying Madison kept him warm enough. Looking down at her pale face, something broke open inside him. For years after losing his wife, he'd kept his prayers formal and distant, protecting himself from feeling too much. But now, with Madison's life hanging by a thread, the words poured out of him. "Lord," he prayed aloud, his voice rough with emotion, "if you would ruin me in mercy. Take my standing in the community if you must. Strip away my pride, but please, please spare her life." The horse stood patiently as Anthony awkwardly mounted, still cradling Madison. He arranged her across his lap, making sure she was secure before taking up the reins. Her head rested against his chest, and he could feel her shallow breathing. "Stay with me," he murmured, urging the horse homeward. "Stay with me, Madison." The journey back seemed to take forever. Anthony kept up a steady stream of prayer, his voice growing hoarse. He spoke of mercy and grace, of second chances and healing. The words tumbled out, raw and honest in a way his prayers hadn't been since Rachel died. Madison drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes murmuring fragments of hymns or apologies. Anthony held her closer, trying to share what warmth he had left. "Not much further now," he told her as the familiar fence line came into view. "Clara's waiting with a warm fire. You'll be all right." His hands, where the dress pins had burned them, were beginning to blister, but Anthony barely noticed. All that mattered was getting Madison to safety. His heart felt strangely light despite his fear, as if in finally praying from the depths of his soul, some long, frozen part of him had thawed at last. The horse picked up its pace at the sight of home, and Anthony glimpsed Clara's anxious face at the window. His prayer continued, no longer a desperate plea but a song of gratitude. "Thank you, Lord, for leading me to her. Thank you for this chance to show your love. Whatever comes next, I accept it as your will." Madison stirred slightly, pressing closer to his warmth. Anthony tightened his grip, protecting her from the bitter wind as they made their final approach to the house. His voice was barely a whisper now, but the words came straight from his heart. "If this is ruination, Lord, let me be ruined, but let it be in mercy. Let it be in love." Dawn painted the eastern sky in pale gold as Anthony gently dabbed snow on Madison's frozen fingers and toes. She lay bundled in quilts near the hearth, her face drawn with pain but alive. Clara hovered nearby, heating more water for compresses. The thunder of hoofbeats outside made Anthony's head snap up. Through the frosted window, he saw Sheriff Cole dismounting, followed by Jacob Wills strutting like a rooster. "Open up, Yoder," the sheriff called, his voice carrying authority but not malice. Anthony squeezed Madison's hand reassuringly before moving to the door. The bitter morning air rushed in as he stepped onto the porch. "We're here about the girl," Sheriff Cole said, his weathered face grave. "Mr. Wills claims she's a runaway he has rights to." Jacob sneered. "That's right. She's mine by contract, and this plain farmer's harboring her illegal-like." Before Anthony could respond, the creak of wagon wheels cut through the tension. A stout woman in a gray dress and bonnet pulled up in a covered wagon, her face kind but determined. "I believe I can shed some light on this matter," she announced, climbing down. "I'm Abigail Dobbs from the Quaker Mission." Jacob's face drained of color as Mrs. Dobbs approached, carrying a leather document case. "I know Madison Pike well," she continued, addressing the sheriff. "She's one of 5 girls who've sought refuge with us after being attacked by this man." She pointed at Jacob. "I have their sworn testimonies here, Sheriff, all telling the same story of assault and betrayal." Sheriff Cole's expression hardened as he read the papers Mrs. Dobbs provided. He turned to Jacob, who had begun backing toward his horse. "Jacob Wills," the sheriff said, drawing his handcuffs, "you're under arrest for assault and fraud." Jacob tried to bolt, but slipped in the snow. The sheriff had him in irons before he could rise. Mrs. Dobbs hurried inside to tend to Madison, while Anthony watched justice unfold in the crisp morning air. His prayer for mercy had been answered, though not in any way he could have imagined. The warmth of May sunshine blessed the land as new grass sprouted between the fence posts. Weeks had passed since that fateful morning when justice found its way to Anthony's door. Now purple wildflowers dotted the prairie, and birdsong filled the morning air. Anthony stood on his porch, watching Bishop Hostetler's wagon approach with 3 other elders. His heart steadied when he felt Madison's presence beside him, Clara holding her hand. The bishop's face looked different now, humbled, almost gentle. He removed his broad-brimmed hat as he approached. "Brother Yoder," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "we have come to ask forgiveness. Our judgment was hasty and lacking in Christ's mercy." The other elders nodded solemnly. Inside the house, they gathered around Anthony's oak table, while Madison poured fresh coffee. "God has shown us our error," the bishop continued, watching as Madison settled Clara with her primer. The girl's finger traced carefully across the page, while Madison guided her through each word. "Your home has become what our church should be, a sanctuary for the broken." Anthony shared his vision then, to open part of his farm as a refuge for women and children with nowhere else to turn. The elders listened intently, and the bishop's blessing came with tears in his eyes. As evening painted the sky in soft pink, Anthony and Madison worked side by side, planting marigolds along the fence line. Her hands had grown sure and strong again, no longer bearing the marks of frost. "These flowers," she said, patting soil around a seedling, "they'll welcome every soul who comes seeking shelter." Anthony touched her shoulder gently. "Will you stay and help them find their way, as my wife?" Madison's eyes filled with tears that caught the sunset's glow. "Yes," she whispered, reaching for his hand. "Yes, I will." 10 years passed like pages turning in a well-loved book. The Yoder homestead had grown from a quiet farm into something remarkable. Where once stood empty fields, now gardens flourished. Where silence had dwelled, joy echoed. Anthony wiped sweat from his brow as he worked to repair a broken fence post near the western field. The summer air hung thick with the scent of fresh-cut hay and wild roses. His hands, weathered but strong, worked the wood with practiced ease. From his vantage point, he could see Madison in the garden, her golden hair touched with the first strands of silver. 6 children gathered around her like chicks to a mother hen. Some were permanent residents of their growing family, others temporary souls seeking shelter. To all of them, she was simply ma'am. "Time for evening prayer, children," Madison called, her voice carrying across the yard. The little ones abandoned their play, running toward her with eager steps. Even Sarah, the newest arrival who had barely spoken a word in 3 weeks, hurried to claim her spot in the circle. "Ma'am, can we sing the butterfly song?" little Joseph asked, tugging at Madison's apron. "After prayer, Liebchen," she promised, smoothing his unruly hair. Anthony paused in his work, hammer resting against the post. The sight before him filled his heart near to bursting. Madison leading their gathered family in prayer, heads bowed beneath the golden evening light. A wagon rattled past on the main road, slowing as it approached their gate. The driver, a stranger with kind eyes, pulled his team to a halt and tipped his hat. "Pardon me," he called out, "but I couldn't help but stop. There's something about this place." He gestured to the flourishing gardens, the children's laughter, the peace that seemed to hover in the air itself. "Feels like a home heaven might envy." Anthony nodded in grateful acknowledgement as the traveler continued on his way. That evening, after the children were tucked into bed and the house settled into its nighttime quiet, he and Madison sat together on the porch. The lamp in the window cast a warm glow across the weathered boards. From the children's room upstairs, sweet voices raised in evening hymns drifted down like a blessing. "I thank God every day," Anthony said softly, taking Madison's hand in his. "His grace proved stronger than any gossip ever could." Madison squeezed his fingers, remembering that long-ago day in Dodge City. "Sometimes I still can't believe how far we've come from that auction block." "Buying you was never purchase," Anthony replied, his voice rich with conviction. "It was providence." They sat together in comfortable silence as the hymn voices floated out into the warm dusk. The lamplight streamed through the window, painting everything in shades of gold. Here was peace, hard-won and precious. Here was love, tested and triumphant. Here was mercy, made real in wood and stone and open hearts. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.